Right, so today I'm super excited. We're going through our epistemology and apologetics. We finished the book 5 Views on Apologetics. Thank God. I was so done with it. And I do not mean that irreligiously at all. I'm really thankful to be done and super excited to now shift gears and to talk about postmodern apologetics. I used to require 2 books for this class, and the second book was called Truth Decay. And I also picked this book because it was on the opposite end of the spectrum from where I'm at. And I was going to use it as like a foil, but I realized I couldn't even make it past the first 3 chapters of this book. And I'm not going to burden you all with that, but I just thought I'd show that to you. You're welcome to borrow it if you're interested. I was a history major in my undergrad, and part of why I was a history major was even as a kid, I felt like there was something wrong in the world. But I couldn't even articulate it. I felt like Neo in The Matrix, and when he has that encounter with Morpheus, and Morpheus says it's like a splinter in your mind, and it's just always nagging you, and you know something's wrong, but you don't know what it is or how to get away with it, or get away from it. And it's part of why I became a history major. I thought, if I could study the history of the world, maybe I could find out what happened or what went wrong. And I think I found the answer, at least what was wrong for me, and why even as a little kid, I felt like a stranger in a strange land. I didn't think like the people around me. Certainly not in my culture at large, but even in my subculture, I always felt kind of like a crazy person or an outcast. And I'm going to go all the way back to the ancient Greeks. We could go further, but it's a good place to start philosophically, because I want to get a running start to explain to you what postmodernism is. If you Google it, or look at a really great source is Stanford Online Encyclopedia. And normally I would not recommend encyclopedias, but this is like peer-reviewed, top-notch. And I think their first sentence is, postmodernism is impossible to define. and it's because I already told you, its philosophical foundation is existentialism, which I told you, I can't define it for you. I can tell you what it means to me, but other existentialists might have a different meaning or interpretation. And so it makes sense if postmodernism is built on that existential foundation, it too becomes virtually impossible to define. But I can show you its historical emergence. And that's what I'm going to do real quick. So if we go all the way back to the Greeks, to the golden age of classical Greek philosophy, we're talking 4th, 5th century BCE. We have coming from the pre-Socratics, which if you've ever taken early philosophy, it started with monistic materialists. And these were people that believed there was one underlying source of reality, but it was physical material from which everything else came. That eventually, and so that's starting over here, that eventually gives way to the pluralist who believed no, it's made up of multiple primordial substances like earth, air, fire, water, became the 4 Greek elements. But then we get into the biggies, like Plato and Aristotle. I'm obviously a Platonist. But it was also at this time, we have a man named Protagoras, who coined this phrase, man is the measure of all things. and secular humanism is born, or humanism is born. And this is the ancient Greek view that even the gods are made in the image of man. The reverse of the Genesis account, where it says man is made in the image of God, the early Greeks said, no, we invented our gods, and we projected our humanness into the heavens, like bigger, better, badder versions of ourselves, with all the passions, all the foibles, but supercharged. And so he said, since we are it, we get to say what is the good, the true, and the beautiful. We make the standards. Now, this eventually gives way, if we talk about Jesus was born somewhere between 8 and 4 BCE, because they got the calendars messed up. But at this time, Greek philosophy gives way to Christian theology. And now, instead of man being the measure of all things, man is seen as like this miserable worm and life is kind of like a pre-purgatory purgatory. It's a time of trial, suffering, endurance, etc. And this continues all the way to, I'm just going to do a rough date here. I'm going to call it 1450 for giggles. We have this decline really beginning around 500 BCE. The Roman Empire falls, the barbarian hordes come in, classical civilization's disrupted, and the church kind of emerged in its place, and this Christian worldview and Christian theology. But it had a very low view of man. But when we get to the 1450s, we have a new occurrence begin, and this is called the Renaissance, which means rebirth. And what we ended up having were these philosophers and theologians, and they looked back to the ancient Greeks as kind of like their intellectual forefathers. But they had also had like almost 1,500 years of Christian culture and influence. And so now we get a new type of, this is the original humanism. Man is the measure of all things. But now we get this Renaissance humanism. And check this out, it's a hybrid. Man and even woman are of value because we are made in the image of God. How wonderful is that? So they're combining the ancient Greek high view of man, but kind of baptizing it, getting away from this medieval man as a miserable worm who's disgusting in the sight of God and each other, to man as of value because they're made in the image of God. And then the Renaissance leads to, when we get to about the 1600s, this is when the modern era begins, philosophically, which always cracks me up because they're like 400 years ahead of pop culture as far as the thinking is going. So from 1600, we get a paradigm shift from the medieval worldview, which goes from basically 500 to 1500. There's a little overlap. History isn't these neat little dates, but so here we have the medieval. And this period would be called the Age of Faith. And what I mean by this is faith is primary. If ever reason and faith clash, faith is superior. Reason becomes the handmaiden of faith, not the other way around. And all the way back to St. Augustine, right in here, 5th century, he says, we believe in order that we may know. The Greeks wanted to explore, observe the world, and then get knowledge. This medieval Christian view was, no, we are given knowledge through revelation, we believe it, and then we get knowledge. So it's a completely reverse idea. When we get here, the paradigm goes from the age of faith to what is now going to be called the age of reason. And with it comes the Enlightenment. And this continues all the way to the 1800s, 18th, 19th century. And we have Descartes, the I think, therefore I am guy, all the way to Immanuel Kant. And Kant, even though he's squarely placed in modernism, this 1600 to 1800 time frame, Kant opens the door to what I would call postmodern thought. Because it's post after modernism. Okay? Now, why do I give Kant credit for being like the gate going from modernism to postmodernism? It has to do with his view of how we could know truth, or if we could know truth. But before I do that, we have another colored pen. That's all right. I'll just do it. What's so interesting to me is this is one of those perspectival pieces. If you are a Christian or coming from a Christian worldview, I wrote this like a secular humanistic timeline. Oh, and by the way, when we get to the modern era, we get a new type of humanism called secular humanism. That's the kind you see today. Man isn't of value because we're made in the image of God anymore. We're of value because we are the highest evolved form of life that we know. So we get to make the rules. So it's like full circle all the way back to the ancient Greeks. So cool. If you were going to plot this, if these were the highlights and lowlights, the secular humanists did not call this the age of faith. They called from 500 to 1500 the Dark Ages. Isn't that interesting? The people calling it the age of faith is the Roman Catholic Church, which is the most powerful force in Europe during that time period. Even more powerful than kings and countries, and amazing. So if we were going to do this timeline from a Christian worldview perspective, these would be low points of deep paganism, and then the glory of Christ ushers in this beautiful age, and then with the Renaissance, we're back into the degradation of humanism and all of that. Fascinating. It's like a mirror. Questions, comments on that?
For the church, that was the age of faith really all that great?
Yeah. They had not only the keys to the kingdom, but the keys to the secular power as well. The Pope could excommunicate a medieval king, and that meant none of his subjects had to obey him or pay their taxes. They could put an inner edict on a country or a province where you couldn't be married or buried or christened or any of that. The sacraments you need to secure grace from God, at least in that their religious context.
Was that really their role though?
Well, what do you mean? Historically it happened.
Yeah, I mean, but was that really was their role in the world, or did they just put that role, like as the church? Was the church really supposed to be that? Like, was the Pope supposed to be the one to be like, oh, you're excommunicated? Like, sorry, you don't get to be a part of this anymore.
Well, do you know what the vicar of Christ is? It's Christ's representation on earth. So he has the keys to the kingdom. And like what Jesus told to Peter, what you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and what you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. So that's a lot of power. Now, if you're asking about my personal beliefs about it, it doesn't really matter. I can tell you later. But I just want you to see this historical progression getting us to Kant, who I'm going to highlight now. Through all this ink. So René Descartes is doing this thing called radical doubt, where he's trying to get to truth, but he doesn't want to have any error. So if he can doubt something in any way, he's going to keep working through it until he can find something he's certain of. But it's precious few things. Like I told you when we were having that discussion about knowledge versus belief, and I told you I only know like 3 things. And that's kind of coming from Descartes. I know I'm a thinking thing that may or may not know stuff. But I know one thing, that I'm a thing that thinks. So it means I'm a thing that thinks that can know multiple things, which means I can know, I'm a thing that thinks, that knows things, and I can know multiple things. That's my 3 things. I know. It just gets silly if you add to it after that. When we get to Kant, he's the last of the modern philosophers. And there's still kind of a hybrid going on between, many of them are still culturally Christian. Some of them may be believers. I mean, I'm not going to judge anyone's salvation or anything like that, but they're part of the Roman Catholic system for the most part. Luther, if you go back to that timeline, the Reformation is happening the same time as the Renaissance. 1517 is when we have Luther breaking from the church. So that is part of this consequence of people using reason and challenging the powers or paradigms that were before them. Kant being the last modern philosopher, he said, while reading the works of Copernicus, do you remember what Copernicus's claim to fame was? Remember Galileo? Similar. But Copernicus was the one who postulated we have a heliocentric solar system. That it is us that's moving around the sun, not the sun moving around us. And you can imagine how unsettling that might be to people who thought it was otherwise. And as Kant was reading this, he had like this kind of aha moment, kind of a both and moment, where we might be orbiting the sun, but the moon is orbiting us. And so you can have kind of this both and sort of thing. We are being orbited and we are orbiting. It's not just an either or, but it's a both and. And he began to apply that back to philosophy. And he made 2 categories: the phenomenal world and then the noumenal world. And I hope I spelled that right. Phenomena is the world of appearances, like how the world appears to us through our sense perceptions, sight, smell, taste, sound, touch, all of that. But the noumenal world is the world as it is. How it truly is in and of itself, not how we're perceiving it. Last night I was giving a lecture, and one of my students was desperately seeking for some objective truth. And he said, "Come on, Blackburn, if I point out the window at that tree, we could both we're both seeing the same tree. And I just started laughing. I said, I guarantee you, we are not seeing the same tree. And then I quoted a medieval theologian at him, Meister Eckhart, who said, the wise man does not see the same tree the fool sees. I wasn't calling the student a fool. I just said, you don't even know me. If you understood my relationship with trees, you would understand we are not encountering trees the same way. Kant goes even further. So Kant says you have to realize all your perceptions are coming from a human perspective. And humans have a limited range of light we can see. We know because of other tools or filters, there's light beyond human perspective. There's ultraviolet and infrared. And with certain goggles or filters, we can see in that spectrum, but not with unaided tools. Same thing with hearing. We have a range of hearing, but we know other animals can hear beyond our range. Same with sight. We have a certain range of seeing. I think someone said the equivalent of like an eagle's eye is that they could read a newspaper at 100 yards. I mean, that's hard to even imagine. I can barely read a newspaper like this. And to imagine to have that kind of vision, or owls with their night vision. But he cautions us and says, don't confuse this with reality. That is a human construct you are using to navigate the world. And we can agree, like I could at least agree with that student that there's something out there we can both call a tree, but neither of us is seeing that tree as it is. We're seeing it from our own perspective. And I would throw this in, from a Christian worldview, I would say God can see this, but God's the only one that sees things as they actually are. The rest of us see things from our personal perspective. But this is why I want to give him credit for opening postmodernism. He's not denying there's an actual, absolute, objective reality out there. He's simply saying that's not what we're perceiving. We're perceiving the world through human terms, through human perspective. Questions on that? So what does this have to do with postmodernism? Well, after Kant, we get a guy named Hegel. And he kind of did like a history of philosophy, starting like we did with the ancient Greeks and working himself up. And he saw philosophy kind of like this organic growth, and it was Geist, or the Spirit of God, moving through history. God incarnating into world history, and the world history basically ending in this enlightenment back into God sort of consciousness, if you can imagine that. So if we start down here with God, and God manifests desire, and these desires begin to articulate into human history, we start with like the barbarians, savages, but then this develops into eventually Greek culture. But when the fullness of time had come, the Greek culture gives way to Christianity. But then Christianity gives way to romanticism. Also, we could throw in like transcendental philosophy. And this, of course, is being developed in Germany, where Hegel is living at the time he's writing it. And so his idea was God is manifesting himself through history, through these different stages. It's almost like this evolution of enlightenment. And the Greeks were materialists, and they did a great job, like with their sculpture, their architecture, the physical form, bodies, but it brought you down your mind into the physical material world. Christianity tried to elevate us and say there's a spiritual world too. And they did this through symbolism. Like, for example, God referring to himself as Father, right? We know God is spirit, so in that sense he doesn't have genitalia, etc. But we use that metaphor of God as our Father. But Hegel believed you had to use philosophy to get to the truth, to get beyond the matter, beyond the symbols, and to get to the abstract philosophy. It's about philosophy. And then, like any plant, so you have this full bloom and flower. But what happens after the flower blooms? The idea was here God manifests himself, he incarnates, and then humanity can self-manifest back into this God consciousness thing. So it becomes like this cosmic loop where God is the beginning and the end and everything in between. What happens after a plant flowers? Yes. And this is where I think Hegel, well, he was done by that point. This comes after him. And it wasn't like all of a sudden Europe and then the world was in this God consciousness united bliss. The flower turns to seed, and in this we have the seeds of postmodernism and the major influences we see in the world today. And these seeds, there's three. Some of the followers were atheist, materialist, and this could be Karl Marx. But then we had other followers who were pantheists, who believed all is God, or everything is spiritual. Here everything's physical material, here everything's spiritual. And then others of his disciples were theists, who believed in both matter and spirit, like dualists. It's so interesting to me in this sort of process, what Hegel had tried to do, in fact, his little model was, the truth is the whole. You don't, if you just try to take the thesis or the antithesis, you're going to miss part of the truth. So you need the thesis, the antithesis, which then produces the synthesis. But he's not saying the synthesis is any more true than the thesis or the antithesis. He's saying the truth is the whole. You have to take them all together. So let me get rid of the worldviews and do something more simple. Hopefully this will give you an aha moment for the postmodern mind, because this is where it's going to happen. So if we take something as simple as, if black becomes our thesis, white becomes our antithesis, and gray becomes the synthesis. But like Hegel's saying, the truth is the whole. if you go to see a black and white movie, you're not going to see a black or white movie. You're going to see a black and white movie that's mostly grayscale. The truth is the whole. But you can do this with anything. You can, like I tried to do this between the tension we talked about between free will and sovereignty. And the synthesis I would call bracketed freedom. We do have real choices with real consequences, but they're bracketed in the sovereignty of God. The truth is the whole. Man is free, God is sovereign, we have limited freedom. Is this making sense? But you see, if you just do an Aristotelian either or type logic, you don't get this. You have to choose. Is God sovereign or is man free? And that's what systematic theologians were doing, and they would keep the verses that supported their view and then rationalize or dismiss the ones that seemed to contradict. And this is saying, no, embrace it all, even if it's not making, find the synthesis, find the balance. Now Marx, he liked Hegel's system, but he was a materialist. He didn't like Hegel's idea that history was the story of God moving through history. So he liked the movement through history part, but he got rid of God. Most people know about this dialectic from Marx's application of Hegel, where he starts, well, this is quite a lead-in definition of postmodernism, but I think it's important. I don't even think the word postmodernism was coined until the 1970s, latter part of the 70s. But like I said, I would trace it back to Kant. So what Marx did, he loved the thesis-antithesis sort of thing. So if we start back with the Roman Empire, in an imperial setting, we'll call the emperor the thesis. The antithesis of the emperor would be the slave. And then this imperial system, the synthesis of these changes to the feudal system. And in the feudal system, the new thesis is the king. And the antithesis of a king is a peasant or a serf. And the synthesis between these two would become like the merchant or the guilds. And then out of this, we get, hopefully I spelled that right, the bourgeoisie, the people that own capital or the means of production, and then those that work for them, the proletariat, the day laborers. And what Marx was hoping was that the synthesis between the bourgeoisie and the laborers would be communism, where everyone's basically equal. So here we go from the greatest inequality to the greatest equality, and that's how Marx saw the progression of human history applying Hegel's dialectic, leaving out God. Questions, comments on that? Okay, that's Marx. This is my addendum to Marx. I think he got a lot of it right, but I think he missed a step. I think what actually appeared was capitalism, and the antithesis of capitalism was communism. Excuse me. What's the synthesis between capitalism and communism? Not yet.
What's the first letter?
S.
Socialism?
Yes.
I want to say, but I was like, I don't know.
Looking familiar? And the antithesis of socialism is anarchy. And if you can predict the synthesis of those two, you could be in the money or in the zeitgeist. I personally think it's this.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna ask you. Is it gonna go back and restart over again?
Yep, the loop. Just like that other loop, and it resets, and you're off again. Oh yeah, Edward, thank you.
Wait, so you said that socialism is the synthesis between capitalism and communism?
Yeah, because it's in between the two.
Is it really? What's the difference between socialism and communism?
Communism is where everyone holds everything in common. In capitalism, it's usually, in socialism, the state usually controls like the means of productions and then tries to distribute to the population. As opposed to capitalism, where it's individuals that own the capital or corporations. Does that make sense? So socialism is kind of in between everyone shares everything equally to there's more of a distribution. But there's still going to be, it's not going to be equal. There's still going to be some that have more than others. But not in like capitalism where you could have wild disparity. Like the 1% in this country owning over 50% of the wealth.
I would say that socialism and communism are a lot closer, though. And socialism is almost the antithesis of capitalism. And it's not quite a synthesis. Because it still breaks down to the government controlling all wealth and means of production and distributing it to the people. Whereas capitalism is the private and the people owning everything, and then distributing it however it happens to the, I'm creating words here, but.
Yeah, no, socialism is not as an extreme form of equality as communism.
Are you saying that because socialism is normally voted in, whereas communism is a...
No, you could have a democratic communism if you wanted. That would make sense. Where you all decide how to spend your collective stuff. But the point is, it's like, it's all shared. What's mine is yours, what's yours is mine. We don't have this private, and in socialism, you could still have some group collective stuff, but you could still have some private individual stuff.
It makes me think of, I think it's like salary, like with base pay with like, there's this one business that was like, one of my friends was working at, and he always goes like above and beyond, but he gets paid like the same as everyone else that may not, that like, some people like don't even really do anything, they're still like unproductive, but they all get paid the same. Doesn't matter how hard you work. So that's why, and it kind of makes me think of that because like, no matter how hard you work, the person that does absolutely nothing is still going to get paid the same. With like, in kind of like, I think, socialism or communism.
Sure.
But, yeah, I don't know why I just made me think of that.
Well, because that's a common capitalistic critique of communism. Oh, it's going to make people lazy because whether you're working your heart out or on constant smoke breaks, you're going to get the same thing. And this whole idea of greed being a virtue of capitalism, like, because if you work hard, you're going to get more profit or
the
payback.
American dream, I believe.
But I'll tell you what, the hardest working jobs I've had in my life, I got paid the least. And the jobs I work the less at, I make way more. And what about the downside of capitalism? What happens with the unregenerate capitalism? You get monopolies. You get corporations running mom and pop businesses out of town. You get them controlling politics. And And so any of these systems outside of the spirit, I think, are going to cause you problems. Could you have a spirit-led capitalism? Sure. Could you have a spirit-led communism? Absolutely. Could you have a spirit-led socialism? Sure. These are economic systems. These aren't theologic systems. Yeah, Edward.
I mean, you said that capitalism breaks that I forget the word that you said, but essentially at least monopoly, right? But,
Yeah.
Or what did you say there?
Yeah, I did say that.
Okay. But how does that happen without government? Without government intervention?
How does what happen?
How do you form a monopoly without
You basically control all the rail lines, or you control all the mines, or you control all the fishing fleets, or you control all the chainsaws. You control all the social media platforms. That's how you get monopoly.
We're finance with AT&T. It's like this.
Is someone else talking? It sounded like someone else was saying something, so.
Yeah, go ahead, Edward.
Okay, well, but still, if then you decide to charge a higher price because you do have a monopoly on something, then the other businesses come in and can do it for cheaper, can charge a less price, and then would beat you out of business.
Yes, but if you have such a big network where you are controlling not only the selling, but you're doing the distribution, you're doing the growing, you can actually edge other people from even getting their toe in the door to compete with you. And that's why in America, we do not have laissez-faire capitalism, which means the government's hand off. We have a modified regulated capitalism. And we have actual laws against monopolies because we see the counter problem that they can cause. But we're not just a full-on capitalism. It's not an unrestrained capitalism, even though some people think it needs to be restrained more.
Well, some people also think that we live in a democracy.
Right, which we do not.
No, we do not.
All right, so Marx, with his vision, is leading to this like collective, this communal. I always like to think, I know it makes me nerdy, but the Borg, from like, join your distinctives with ours. Let's work together in this cooperative whole. And so with Marx, we have the collective as the thesis versus the next seed is existentialism with Soren Kierkegaard. And his whole theme is the individual. And these become the two most powerful philosophies moving into the 19th century, into the 20th century. In fact, the world gets divided between these two ideologies. Here it manifests in capitalism, here in communism. It's not true communism, it's much more like a socialism, like what Edward was talking about. We haven't seen true communism in the world, except in theory, maybe the early church for a little bit, but not in like a national scene. And I don't know, maybe socialism is the in-between between the radical individualism and the radical collectivism. Okay, so with this rise of movements, people begin to challenge those modern paradigms. And in that age of modernism, what came to rise were specifically science and reason. And just as religion, specifically Christianity, had told people where we come from, what's the meaning and purpose of life, how should we live, what happens to us when we die, all those big philosophic religious questions Christianity had answers for. Well, as Christianity is being displaced, it's now being challenged by science and by reason. Science in the 19th century offered us another explanation of where we came from, that it was through evolution. Through the Big Bang, the cosmos came into being. And then through biogenesis, innate matter became animated life. And you don't need a God anymore. You just have natural processes. And then we use reason to literally reason God right out of the universe. And like I talked about Thomas Aquinas, he started the whole faith and reason sort of thing. Well, by the time we get to the end of the modern era, reason has pretty much said faith is unreasonable. Or you get Christians who have bought into this and want a reasonable faith. Fascinating. But it's coming from this period. And this is part of the paradox to me. If you flash back to that timeline, Christianity went kicking and screaming from the medieval into the modern period. But once they got in there, they embraced the tools of science and reason and capitalism and all those other isms we were talking about, and they used them to their own benefit or their own goals. Once the modern period began to come to an end, however, it was the same thing. Christians do not want to leave and come into postmodernism. They're kicking and screaming, saying, no, we don't want all this relativism, and there's no absolutes, and yada, yada, yada. And everyone pretty much has moved, besides the hard sciences and the fundamentalist Christians. They both want to stay in the modern era, and they keep arguing with each other using modern tools, like reason, evidence, data, science, where the rest of the people in the arts, literature, technology, philosophy, we've all moved on. We're looking at things in a very different place, and part of it is this critique that science, reason, or religion, these would all come under the category of what's called meta-narratives. And the postmodernists are saying, no. They are trying to put all this knowledge or meaning to explain everything in the world in these systems, but these systems can't hold up to the task. There's too many flaws, too many contrary perspectives for any of these to be true. And they try to impose their truth on other people that may not share it or agree with it. Fascinating. So it becomes a war of ideology or meta-narratives like, our God is over all, or my reason trumps your faith, or my science trumps your religion. And so we get all these like worldview conflicts going on as residuals from this modern period. And the postmodernists are saying, it's perspectival. You guys don't know what the absolute truth or purpose or meaning of life is. That's your opinion, that's your opinion, that's your opinion. It's just your opinion, man. And so postmodernism in this sense is a reaction to the meta-narratives of modernism. So I guess you could say the postmodern narrative is there is no narrative. And you say that's self-contradictory. Well, they don't care. Because they don't care if it's not reasonable or rational, because that's just your paradigm. And you might say, well, no, Blackburn. But I think why I like this so much, and back to why I studied history, is as I began to see what had happened in the history of the world, I realized I was like a pre-modern living in a modern world. And so when postmodernism started to hit the scenes in America in the 50s, 60s, and especially the 70s, I was just like, yes. Not that we'd gone back to pre-modern or medieval, where I'm comfortable, to a degree. I mean, obviously, if I popped in from the 21st century Southern California to a medieval village, I would be horrified at the ignorance, superstition, the smells, the disease, But I have a romantic view of the Middle Ages, at least, where I live in my head. And these things, I see the value of them, but I also see the incredible abuse and danger, right? Look at the holy wars we've had in the name of God. Look at the rationalization we've used to justify all kinds of horrific things, or to reason God out of his own creation. Science promised all these wonders, and it delivered. Lots of vaccines, lots of cures, lots of medicine, but it also delivered thermonuclear warheads and the ability to potentially annihilate life on the planet. It's like, give me a break. These aren't like our saviors. And so the postmodernists are just saying, don't gum me up with your all-inclusive truths. I gotta live my own truth in my own life, in my own perspective. That is how we get to postmodernism from the ancients. Okay, is that good?
Yeah. Whenever you were talking about science, reason, and religion, I just had like an image in my hand, of, like a big game of like rock, paper, scissors.
Yeah,
Between the things.
that's great. Like whack-a-mole.
Yeah.
Okay, where I want to go now, I think I'm going to pause this here, but I think that's a nice explanation, because you really can't say much more than that about postmodernism without me projecting my truth, my perspective onto you, which you may or you may not agree with. Now, once again, a lot of people want to just knee-jerk reaction and say, yeah, but postmodernism is self-contradictory if they're not believing in absolutes. Once again, that would be like a very unsophisticated postmodern. Like Kant, I would say, yeah, sure, there's absolute truth. But me as a human cannot perceive what that is. Because I can't see the noumena. I can only see the phenomena. And the phenomena is going to look different from my perspective than your perspective.
Would you argue like that the Holy Spirit has given like us a glimpse into the noumena?
Yeah, I would call it like lightning flashes in the darkness. That would be my one exception as a Christian. I believe God can reveal absolute truth to us.
Yeah.
But once again, even if you're telling me the most absolute, universally true thing in the world, as soon as I hear it, I'm going to subjectify it. Because I'm a subject. Remember, I sketched that little thing out of View from Nowhere, of how we can't get to a perspective where we can see all perspectives, because we're still going to be seeing it from our perspective. No matter where we go, there we are. God can see all perspectives all the time. Hence, he has all truth, capital T truth, etc. Now, if he can reveal that to you and illuminate that to you through his word or creation or his spirit or the incarnation, that's wonderful. But I would still be humble and realize it's still processing through my fallen reason, through my broken mind, which is being renewed, but it's still not there yet. I misreason every day, miscalculate, etc. But postmodernism is simply saying, Let's stop doing these grand themes, which actually end up oppressing a lot of people. And let's start focusing more on individuals and our relationships and community. And why I like this, because I am coming more from a religious tradition. What you saw in the Age of Reason is religion went from being here to being beat down and degraded. And science was just being born, and it elevated itself to the top. And so now we have science over there, and reason, and now religion is the Dark Ages, right? Repressive, backwards, old-fashioned. The postmoderns are like, actually, the religious perspective was just as valuable as your reason one, and your scientific one, and all these other perspectives you discredited. They're equally as like the Yanomamo Indians. Guess what? Their perspective's just as valuable as yours. The Chinese, women, minorities, etc. And so it makes like this even playing field where no one gets an upper hand on anyone else because it's all just your perspective. All right? Okay, I'm going to stop there.
Should I pause the Do you want me to pause this?
You can stop that.
Okay.